This is Utkarsh, the founder of Network Capital. Today, I'm really excited to host Harsh and Rajeev, the authors of a new book called A New Idea of India, where these investors, business people, and also writers have asked us to consider a new idea of India. This is an idea of India where they believe it's more inclusive and it brings to bear the civilizational history. Many people disagree with them, many people agree with them, but that's why I invited both of them, who are my friends, and I know them from different walks of life. But today, let's engage with this new idea of India. So, welcome, Harsh, Rajeev. It's so good to have you on Network Capital TV.
Thank you,
Thank
Utkarsh.
you. Thank you, Utkarsh.
So, this book started off as a collection of articles that both of you have written for Mint, Wall Street, and other reputed places, but it became something else, right? So, tell us about the journey of writing this book and how you had to sort of change the order, change the structure as it went along. Because as I understand, it became a lot more detailed and a lot more revised than you would have thought initially, right?
No, most definitely. Our initial sort of thought around this back almost, I think, 5 years ago now. When we were just kicking around this idea was that having written over 100 columns each and probably 4, 5 dozen jointly,
Hmm.
uh, we thought let's bring together what we've put out there in the public discourse domain and make it accessible, readable as a kind of compilation or anthology. But as we were doing that, we realized that some of the material had obviously become a little dated. It was maybe a few years old. Those debates themselves had changed form. So then, we went about rewriting and editing and researching sort of new angles, went down new rabbit holes, and it became a much more expansive project actually in that sense.
Right. And this process of adding new material, Harsh, do you want to add something to Rajiv opening?
Yes, absolutely. First of all, once again, thank you so much, Utkarsh, for having us. To the viewers, I'm just letting you know, Utkarsh and I went to the same B school. And, Rajiv, in turn, I actually met when I came back from my college. From my undergraduate, I met him in 2009. We had similar views on a range of issues, and we started organizing events, small events, writing together. So, as Rajiv said, we wrote about 50 odd columns together and many more columns separately. We tried to begin together. And around a few years ago, what happened was with the change in government in India in 2014, and that government, that of Mr. Narendra Modi being re-elected in 2019, like the debate on so many issues kind of moved much faster than we had anticipated. And when we were finishing the book in 2020, the corona pandemic brought us back to the same city, namely Kolkata. It was all at the first year of the second government. Narendra Modi was so action oriented across a range of spheres that it seems like he was actually doing stuff faster than we were writing. Uh, so it was one of those things that we were constantly re-editing, and then we finally had to said we have to stop here because the economic policy issues, the civilizational issues, the pace was so intense that we had to draw a line. And we just managed to get a bit of, maybe a few paragraphs, a couple of pages on the coronavirus pandemic itself, which
Yeah.
in itself is an shattering kind of event, which will have probably a shadow on the rest of our lives, both good and bad. So I think we had to finally call it a day and say there are more books to be written. This seems like a nice attempt, nice first stab. So let's kind of wrap it up here, which is what we did a few months ago.
So, Harsh and I went, yeah, Rajiv and I know each other from a variety of places, one of which is the Observer Research Foundation.
Also, World Economic Forum.
World Economic Forum, and a variety of intersections. I'm always fascinated by how dots come together. And then I see Harsh and Rajiv, who I knew independently, partnering on this initiative. It's always a joy to see, great work happen from different walks of life. But what my listeners won't know is that perhaps you're both active investors, one in public markets and one in venture capital and other kinds of industries. So when people with very intense day jobs embark upon a journey of such writing, Tell me about the schedules, guys. How did you figure this out? Because this is not easy research. I mean, I was going through it. This is a lot of work. Tell us about how young professionals can manage, say dual careers in a way.
Okay, I'll go
Yeah, go
first.
first.
I'll
Yeah,
say that you're absolutely right, Utkarsh. We almost have 100 pages of references,
Yeah.
so it would not be wrong to say that we definitely put a lot of kind of toil and sweat in this one. And I think the way I would see it is, you're right. I do public market investing. Rajeev does both public and private, especially venture. And both of us, as you began by saying, are India enthusiasts. So actually, part of the job of building an India hypothesis in your head, in my head, in Rajiv's head, is actually reading very widely and not just related narrowly to finance, but broadly to economics, political economy, sociology at times, and the larger global context.
Hmm.
In that sense, while they are seemingly separate areas, they're not completely orthogonal. And so one thing which I like to quote often is some people call investing to be the last liberal art. So investing in writing or writing broadly, like non-fiction type of writing, are the two areas where you can read widely and not feel that you're wasting your time. So in a way, while they seem very disconnected and they do seem like dual career, one vocation, the underlying kind of root of both of them is basically reading widely, having a particular view about India, especially. So in that sense, while it was a lot of work, they were not completely disconnected from each other. Rajiv?
no, yeah, and I think one of the key things in investing is to have a strong thesis, has to is to have a strong viewpoint, right, about the future,
Yeah.
and then you're essentially putting capital behind that viewpoint. So I think as you at a macro level start thinking about India and all the changes that are happening here and have been happening for the last 2 or 3 decades, then you kind of form an opinion, and if you put that into a certain written form, you start discussing that in terms of the particularly the social and economic changes that are coming. Then it kind of overlaps pretty neatly, like I described, with sort of an investing type of uh, job. And I'll also add on the mechanics of it. People often ask how do two people collaborate on a book, especially if you're not in the same city and so on.
But you
When,
city, no? Not now?
sorry, what?
Both of you are not in the same city now?
No, so at the moment I'm in Mumbai. Harsh is in Kolkata, and even actually all over the last decade, all through the last decade, Harsh and I think have been mostly in different cities.
I see.
Uh, Very infrequently, actually, we've been in the same
Yeah.
uh, city that way. So I would just put that down to using sort of productivity software, collaboration software, and so on. I mean, you write something, you email someone the draft, they get back to you over a period of time,
Hmm.
and there are no shortcuts. As you pointed out, there's a lot of research in the book, so that entail a lot of sleepless nights, a lot of like burning the midnight oil.
Over and above your very busy job. So, what point?
Yes, yeah. So especially towards the end, actually, it required like an intense sort of last mile sort of push
Hmm.
from both of us. And in some ways, actually, because the pandemic kind of forced us to stay in Calcutta, I think in some ways we were able to actually do it a little faster.
Hmm.
So the final draft got completed between like April and July. So those 2-3 months of the lockdown in a weird way actually may have helped us wrap up the book.
Right. One point that Rajiv, I'd like you to build on. Harsh said that it's also part of the larger investing thesis that he is. So, the book is not really, a completely different space. It does connect in some way to both your work. So, while you were writing this book, did you follow a certain kind of routine or a regimen? And I'd love for both of you to explain, because I really want our listeners to understand the mechanics of dual careers, even if they are not sort of separated. How might you optimize? Spending time with friends and family, then working on your quote unquote day job, and then writing extensively.
So I think it really varies from person to person, however they choose to do it and whatever works for them. I'll just kind of give you a glimpse of how I do things. So let's say if I'm reading you know the news blogs etc. that I do on a regular basis, a daily basis, and a germ of an idea comes into my mind, I sort of note it somewhere, usually in pages or in Evernote or somewhere. I
Hmm.
kind of have a running list of potential column ideas, potential article ideas, and so on. So I
Hmm.
keep logging them like that. And then if I find related material, I put it in the same note.
Hmm.
So I never sit down and write a column from start to finish. So when I write a particular column, that column has probably been in the works for months, if not sometimes years, actually.
I see.
Because it just builds up, and then I feel like I have enough material, and then I sort of
Hmm.
write the 1,000 words. But I think it really varies from person to person. I'm sure Harsh has a very different process.
Tell.
Uh, it really is a very personal thing, I guess.
Yes.
No, I fully agree with Rajiv. I am not as methodical as Rajiv is. So I mean, I have to write time when I'm either really inspired or really angry or something like that. That helps a lot to get it out. I mean, but one thing that I agree and which is common with Rajiv is that any column or any good piece of writing um, is often building within you at least for months. You're thinking about the thesis, you're thinking of the dots. Whether you put it in Evernote or you put it in your brain, you're definitely thinking about it,
Yeah, yeah.
and then it kind of just comes out one day because if you don't, at least in my case, then that day is going to be terrible. You have to write at that moment.
It
And
feels compelling.
yeah,
You're compelled to sort of put it out.
yeah, exactly. You're compelled to put it out. And in my case, actually, in that sense, our uh, while it was occasionally, Rajiv's methodical style and mine slightly more kind of intuitive, passion-driven style, okay, very occasionally clashed, but it was also very good kind of complement to each other in the sense that, you know, um, so I would bring certain notes, and Rajiv would kind of organize it in a certain way. I would say this, and then I would help him. And so the way of writing was very complementary to each other in that sense. And as but nonetheless, we did need like about a couple of months. I would visit Rajiv's place. Rajiv would visit my place. We both live relatively nearby in Kolkata, which is where we were both born and brought up. Even though both of us have been in various countries, if not cities, last 10 years. So that allowed us to kind of sit together on a giant screen, and like one of us would pace around, one of us would write it out. It's a unique experience because as you also written a book right now, Karsh, but that's just you, right? So it's different writing a book by yourself versus with somebody else. In fact, I have written another book earlier with two co-authors, so that's three people. A book on financial derivatives. That's more of a textbook,
Right.
uh, published by Cambridge University Press, and that also had its own unique kind of dynamic. So I think co-authoring is always a bit of an interesting challenge, but it also brings out the best. Like it's like you're sitting together, and sometimes two one plus one is, as they say, 11, not two, right? It just the ideas bounce back very fruitfully. So
Hmm.
there are pros and cons of both, but I think Rajiv and I gelled very well together in finishing this project.
So both Rajiv and Harsh are passionate about mental models, and that comes up a lot in books because they encourage us to, think from basic principles, and that comes out in a wide range of thoughts. Um, Talk to us about some of the mental models that you've used to deconstruct. I mean, there are way too many, so I don't expect all of them, but perhaps the ones that really jumped out, perhaps the Talib ones that you've talked about. Would love for you to add color to it. Why mental models in analyzing a country, or why
Uh,
not?
so I think I mean mental models, as just for the audience's benefit, is something. For example, the phrase Charlie Munger uses, which is simply a way of saying that there are different frameworks in different areas of life. For example, from economics, from political economy, from sociology, finance, and you basically quote different writers and philosophers and their ways of looking at the world. And in many ways, new knowledge or new books are combining pre-existing mental models and applying that to a particular set of data or context. You're always standing on the shoulders of giants. You're never kind of really going from absolutely ground up. So you're right. We quote Talib a lot. We use his. I mean, his more well-known ones about skin in the game. We use towards the second half of the book, in which we're talking about India's governance and incentives. But we use his many of his insights, which are less well known in the first half, in which he says there are cultures and there are cultures, there are religions and there are religions, and he says there are very different ways of understanding them, and you cannot have a cookie cutter way of understanding different in a way which goes to a point of India being a unique civilization. We also quote amongst Western philosophers Karl Popper a lot.
Yeah.
We quote him from his Open Society and the Enemies in terms of the paradox of tolerance and intolerance. We quote a lot of Western economists like Gary Becker. He writes about economics of discrimination. We also quote a lot of Indian philosophers and dharmic philosophers, whereby we use dharmic frameworks and mental models about how India historically has dealt with pluralism and multiplicity while being very harmonious, respectful, and how that is potentially a model for India today, but also the world at large. So there is definitely a unique sense coming from that side, and I think other than these kind of meta models, we also quote in the beginning from scientists and physicists, including people like Oppenheimer and other people who find Indian civilizational ideas very unique. We actually begin the book by saying that the Rig Veda, the very kind of mother lode of all Indic Vedic dharmic ideas, is extremely kind of amenable to skepticism. That even while it prescribes a lot of things, it says we are not sure if this is fully true. We just believe this. Maybe even the gods don't know who created the universe, and so on and so forth. The tone is very much, again, amenable to what we would call falsifiability in science, to quote Karl Popper. So there are these different views that we bring in together, very unique to the way Rajeev and I think, both across Indian and Western thinkers.
So just what Harsh said was, if something is not falsifiable, it's not scientific, and
Yeah.
scientific, yeah, like one should be more skeptical of it. But I noticed that this entire analysis, you both are very comfortable with, say, the dharmic identity, or say the Indic identity. Um, I think that requires a bit more explanation. Explain it to it in really simple terms, because many of our subscribers are also not from here. So perhaps you want to explain that in a little bit um, of detail, while also explaining that you're not, say, against, anything. If that's the case, and if you are against, then you should also let it be known. Because while Harsh and Rajiv, I know them as delightful, dinner companions. Occasionally in the book, they also take a strident tone. So I would love for them to explain that, especially this dharmic philosophy. What do you really mean by that?
So I would say, if you pick up on this one idea from dharmic philosophy, which says "Tat Tvam Asi," which basically from the Sanskrit translates to "You are that," and it says that each individual should treat others in the way they want that individual to treat them.
Hmm.
And I think many of dharmic ideas today are popular in what in the West is called multiculturalism, in a sense. So as we argue in the book, dharma is kind of the original multiculture,
So
where the
in a way,
yeah as the original multiculture, where there is mutual respect, there is kind of deep empathy, and that kind of an approach, we make the case in the book, has had a place in Indian civilizational ethos for multiple millennia.
Got it.
So if I had to put it very simply, I would put it that way. And Harsh, if you want to add something.
Yes, absolutely. I think absolutely Tattvamasi or Aham Brahmasmi. The idea is that you are me, I am you. We are all kind of one. I mean, there are different. That's more Advait. There are also Dvait and other philosophical strands in ancient and medieval Indian thought. But broadly, the idea within dharma is, and dharma is one of those kind of non-translatable words. So it does. There is a misconception that it translates into religion, but it's actually the translation of dharma is not religion. The translation of dharma would be something that defines this entire civilization. So religion is one aspect of it, ethics is one aspect of it, law is one aspect, order is one aspect. And the root word dharma comes from the word ta, which literally means the kind of universal order. So dharma is basically what we see is what constitutes the core of Indian civilization. And what we mean by that is, for example, even Shashi Tharoor, who also Utkarsh knows very well, if you read his book, like Who is a Hindu? Like, I mean, I'm quoting him because I'm saying generally he is somebody who would be seen as, by the way, he gave a very good blurb to our, for our book.
Say that I read his, and he was actually on Network Capital TV 3 back. So he had very lovely things to say about the
Yeah,
book.
exactly. So he said that while I agree with certain premises and conclusions, while I disagree with certain premises and conclusions, I find the book extremely interesting and we agree on XYZ. So the reason why I quote Shashi is just to say that it's a consensus across so-called right and so-called left, and we can discuss separately that even the right and left terminology does not make sense in India. But on the so-called right and the so-called left, there is consensus. But there is something unique about dharmic ideas, one of which is there is no central core belief that you must believe, and if you do not believe, you will be sent to hell for eternity, or if you must follow this path or this prophet or this one holy book. And that multiplicity at the core of it, that if you do not do this, then also it's fine, so long as you respect somebody who does the other thing. Like, you know, the only core requirement in that sense is you have to respect other people's beliefs. You do not have to believe what they're believing, but so long as you do not disrespect them for their beliefs, you're part of this kind of dharmic superstructure. You know, and some of my friends and guides and mentors like Sanjeev Sanyal, who Rajeev also knows very well, who is the principal economic advisor, and other people have said, for example, dharma is like an open source operating system, right? It's like Android to some extent, where you can have different apps. Like you can have like a Shiv app, you can have a Buddha app, you can have, you know, Jain app. Jainism is not necessarily even theistic in an English sense. It might be defined as atheist or agnostic. It is more about ethics and values. For example, Jainism. So you can have different apps on this OS, so long as none of the apps are basically threatening the other apps. And dharma is kind of the superstructure, the OS itself. Dharma is not an app by itself. So, and even Bruno Maçães, a former Portuguese minister, somebody who works in I'm forgetting which think tank he works in right now, a very well-known writer in strategic circles. He actually compared dharma to Western liberalism in the sense that dharma is a structure within which everything exists, right? So you, for example, you can be a Republican or a Democrat, but you're when you say liberals in America, you generally mean left liberal or Democrats. But outside of America, even the Republicans are seen as small L liberal. The Democrats might be capital liberal. In fact, many of the Australian right-wingers are liberal nationalists and so on and so forth. So dharma is the kind of operating system which says what we need is everybody to respect the other person. And why is that multiculturalism, as Rajeev mentioned, as we wrote, is the original multiculturalism? So if you look at some, like a Hindu god like Ganesh, so like Ganesh is a different kind of family story in different parts of India. Like, you know, you might have a brother by a certain name in South India, might have a different story in North India. And what the leaders of our civilization did in many centuries and millennia past by is they sometimes subconsciously, but often deliberately, linked all the local gods, the tribal gods, to the more prominent gods through this concept of avatars and incarnations, so that everybody had a local version which they kind of felt grounded and rooted to, but they were part of this kind of civilization, which, you know, Dinah Egg, the famous author, calls the India, what's the name of the book, Rajeev? Dinah Egg's book?
Forgetting the India Sacred Geography.
India Sacred Geography. So Dinah Egg's thesis is that, you know, somebody from South India goes to Badrinath in North India, somebody from East goes to Dwarka in Gujarat, and, you know, so these kind of holy, which might be of different, might be Sikh, Buddhist, Hindu, whatever, but these pilgrimages, including Sufi shrines. You know, in fact, many Hindus even go to Ajmer Sharif. You know, there are people who disagree with that and all that, but there are many Hindus who have gone to Ajmer Sharif, which is actually a Muslim shrine. So there is this concept of a sacred geography within India, which basically means that you can follow any particular god. In Sanskrit, it's called Ishtadev, which is your personal god. Then there is something called a Kuldev, which is your family traditional god. And the thing is, you can change your Ishtadev. And those Ishdev and family gods are actually linked to kind of gods from other parts of India. And I think it was done deliberately over the centuries. So what happens is you call Murugan, you worship Murugan in South India, you worship Kartiki or Ganesh in North India, whatever it is. And that multiculturalism, that multiplicity kind of just harmoniously pre-existed together. So long as nobody says that what you believe is wrong, this whole thing kind of continues. And therefore, actually, Western multiculturalism in a small m sense, without the government welfare and all that, is actually a very deeply dharmic and Indic idea. Because, Europe was earlier known as Christendom till about 100 years ago. And till 150 years ago, even many Jews did not have any rights. I mean, even forget Nazi Germany, even the rest of Western liberal Europe and North America, they slowly got enfranchised and got the right to vote and so on and so forth. In Switzerland, women got the right to vote as late as 1971. So there is a sense that dharma is basically what allows us to be together. Because if you think about it, and this is a bit more controversial, that Pakistan and India are two separate nations, right? Even though Punjab is in both places. Bangladesh and India are two separate nations, and happily so, even though Bengal are in both places. So there is a certain sense of ideas which might be across demographics. What keeps India coherent as India? And so you have to, without going in a narrow sectarian way, you must understand what keeps India together, because people of Indian Punjab and Jammu are very happy being with Tamils of India and vice versa, even though the Punjabis of India don't want to be with the Punjabis of Pakistan and vice versa. So it's a question that we need to ask: why is that the case? Why are the Punjabis of India and Pakistan not happy with each other? They're happy meeting each other in foreign lands, as you know, I know, and many of our fellow students, colleagues, alumni know. But why is it that they don't want to be part of the same country? And we actually write in the book, culture and civilization, even though they're related words, they're not exactly the same thing. Like culture might be about dance, food, and music, but civilization is deeper, what we call soul deep instead of skin deep. And what happens in very kind of cosmopolitan circles is we want to wish it away, but that reality has a way of not being wished away. And if you want to understand the world at large, whether Donald Trump wins or loses, it looks like he's going to lose. Nonetheless, a lot of commentators were saying, well, there is a so-called right-wing kind of group emerging across the world, right? From Brexit to Trump to Bolsonaro to Erdogan to Modi and so on and so forth. And there are different reasons, and you cannot compare all these people. It's definitely not one-to-one. But we need, without agreeing with Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilization, at least we need to respect and acknowledge that there are, in that particular sense, different civilizations. So I think the book kind of acknowledges that and says India is not just a post-1947 kind of invention in terms of modern republic. That is only its latest avatar, to use the dharmic term. It's only the latest incarnation. So I think, I don't know if that kind of cleared up what dharma means, the way we are coming at it, but to some extent, I hope it does.
It definitely does. Do you want to add something to that, Rajeev?
No, I think that's I think both of us have sort of explained it, and together I think it kind of makes sense. And obviously, there's a lot more in the book about it. Actually, this is such a rich topic that you could spend hours discussing this, and it would take up all the time.
You combined it, in the idea of it. So just a quick follow-up. Do you think in this dharmic superstructure that both of you talk about in the book, does it include all Indians, like all Indians of all ethnicities and backgrounds? Are they all part of this superstructure? And do you think they're aware of it or comfortable of this identity, or are you introducing a relatively new concept that people should consider?
I think every Indian is part of every Indian citizen is part of this identity, no matter what, for the simple reason that our constitution would understand and promote mutual respect. So remember, when we talk about equality, liberty, which is the big kind of Western debate, people forget about the third ITY in France, which is fraternity.
Yeah.
Right. So, I mean, all these Western political debates about equality and liberty, but people forget fraternity. Fraternity is basically saying that you have to respect each other. Like you cannot you cannot have a passport because you're born in one part of territorial terra firma on this planet called Earth. Nations are what we call organic entities. People kind of know each other, like each other. They have, at least to some extent, some common understanding of history, some common understanding of where they're going in the future. It's an organic spiritual principle. We quote Ernest Renan, a European philosopher, on that. So I absolutely think that all Indians are part of it. And if any Indian is not, he or she chooses it. I don't think any major religion there are interpretations of all major religions that would allow every Indian to be part of the way Rajiv and I see India. But if somebody chooses a very literalist understanding of certain ideas, then I think that is his or her choice. But I think by default, everybody is absolutely a part of this superstructure, the civilization and the constitution in India, which kind of overlaps.
And I would just quote from what Ernest Renan, the French philosopher, had said on he had given this very evocative lecture on what titled "What is a Nation." So, and he had said, and I quote, "A nation is a soul, a spiritual principle. Two things which, properly speaking, are really one and the same, constitute this soul, this spiritual principle. One is the past, the other is the present. One is the possession in common of a rich legacy of memories. The other is present consent, the desire to live together, the desire to continue to invest in the heritage that we have jointly received." So I think all citizens in India would, or rather, I would say almost all. Maybe there are some groups who don't subscribe to it. Some small fringe
See,
groups don't subscribe to it.
I would add by saying this. For example, people, differentiate. Hey, look, America's civic nationalism versus kind of the ancient old world Europe and Asia is kind of territorial or ethno nationalism. But I think that's a false divide. Even in America, I mean, there are differences, but even in America, everybody kind of gets emotional around the flag and the idea of liberty, right? So you can have different national origins, different skin colors, but American politicians routinely use the word un-American. They say this is un-American, right? They say that. So to that extent, to say this is un-Indian is just an analogy. So there could be some un-Indians, but for example, it's a dormant law. It's not often used, but if you are a Communist Party member in any part of the world and you're applying for a US visa, you're supposed to actually acknowledge that. And by certain laws or precedents, you may not get the visa. Whether it's always enforced in practice or not, and you were just a college communist enthusiast, that's a separate issue. But then one can say, well, what is the American quote-unquote religion or civic religion or national religion, which kind of incites them or encourages them to, make communists untouchable? And if you think in those, so the thing is, we have to get outside the box of what constitutes a national identity and a civic religion, because these often we get confused by semantics. And if you look at America in that sense, there is a common religion of Americanism, which kind of centers on this idea of liberty, even though the right and left might have different interpretations of the word. And therefore they say, a communist is un-American. You don't have to be a McCarthyite to say that. That is the American equivalent of adharma, right? And a communist can be from any background. So I think, we quote Karl Popper on this. You have to reserve the right to not tolerate the intolerant, but that should not be the default. The default should be try to convince by persuasion, by rhetoric, by articulation, by logical reasoning and argument. And you have to give everybody a long rope. But finally, any nation state, especially one that is on the fertile bed of a civilization, has to reserve the right to not tolerate the intolerant beyond a point. So I think it's a very nuanced structure where you cannot have a narrow interpretation.
You basically flipped the common intolerant analogy, which I will let the readers or listeners figure it out. But it is definitely one valid interpretation. Look, we began the show by saying this is one interpretation by two investors. Sure. We also just want to do a quick deep dive into the fact that if you were to look all factors considered at where India stands today and what India has arrived, do you think that the Indian definition of secularism, which is slightly different from the technical definition of secularism, has played a constructive role or a less constructive role? And for our listeners, the way secularism is traditionally defined is the separation of religion and state. And in India, it is equality of all religion in the eye of the state. So what do Harsh and Rajeev think about that? They have touched about it in a very interesting way, but I'd like for them to give you or leave you with another thought.
No, so let me have a go at that first. So chapter 3 of the book actually delves into this in detail. And this is obviously one of the most contentious debates in India.
Yeah.
what is secular, and frequently the opposite of secularism in India is portrayed as communalism. And our case is that the opposite of secularism is actually theocracy. So a state can be secular. To ask for a society to become secular is frankly patently absurd, because society is composed of individuals. Individuals will have their own sort of beliefs, ideas, views about the world, maybe about the afterlife, maybe about the before life, whatever. And it's really not possible to secularize society in a sense unless you want to go down the road of Mao and Stalin. I do think that one of the big issues, the big sort of social dividers in India, has been the abuse of this word called secularism, which is why the chapter that we've written on this is called "Saving Secularism from the Secularists." And in fact, we call for a restoration of secularism properly practiced, properly understood, and Utkarsh, you've read the book, so we've made a detailed case of how different governments, even different courts in India, the judiciary, they have actually made a mockery of this word, and to the larger detriment of India actually, where intuitively a lot of people question it. They may not necessarily vocalize it perfectly, but they see it as kind of a political scam, to be very honest. And it has become that way because of certain malpractices of the last several decades.
Got
So
it.
just to add on that, yes, exactly. So I put it very kind of in a very short way, is that India does not practice the secularism of A, what Utkarsh rightly mentioned was the separation of state and religion, and B, seeing citizens as individual citizens in front of the state. So in fact, they try to say Sarva Dharma Sambhav, which is what Utkarsh kind of translated into English as seeing all religions equally or in some egalitarian manner, with the kind of postmodern idea of therefore giving some religions a leg up because either they are minorities or endangered or whatever the interpretation. Even the equal is not always equal. If at all, it can be equal in once the state enters the domain of religion, which to some extent by definition is irrational, right? There can be no definition. There can be no saying this was an equal treatment because two religions are so different. How do you even define that you treated them equally unless you completely withdraw from the process? So in India, we've not had secularism either of the American format or the French format. So just for the American format is very liberal.
In some sense, what actually, to be very clear, what happens in India is religion-based discrimination in the name of secularism.
So basically, there are laws in India, even today in 2020, which, for example, only allow certain people to marry 4 times, and other people, including of both genders, cannot marry more than 1 time. And my point is, it is stupid for anybody to marry more than once. But why should the law allow anybody to marry 4 times? Like it should be the same for everybody.
Multiple partners is what Harsh is referring to. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, my point is that by law, the law should treat all citizens equally. Isn't that the basic understanding of liberal secularism? And in India,
you talk about some cases where it has been applied differently, but I think people should definitely read the book on that. But if you could just conclude this particular topic by explaining what might Indian future look like. I don't think what you're saying is that every Indian should become religion X, but what you are saying that it's the way to go about it. So what's the vision for the future? Suppose,
for example, the vision is very simple. For if you could have not exactly that, but you could have a system of laws, the way, for example, the US has or an Australia has, whereby everybody in front of the state is just an individual citizen. Your Utkarsh's religious identity, Rajeev's or Harsh's, or anybody else's does not matter. The same marriage laws, divorce laws, inheritance laws, adoption laws, education regulations for schools based on people of one religion to see the other, regulating the places of worship, temples or mosques or churches, they should be all exactly the same in the law. There should be no discrimination against anybody by law. So the American example is there. The Australian, Canadian example is there. I'm not saying the British, because even though the British in practice is fine, but they have a state religion, technically the Anglican religion. The French example is there, but it's slightly liberal. In fact, they try to ban many religious kind of symbols in government funded schools and bureaucratic offices. But there are so many models, and we can choose our own unique model. It need not copy anybody blindly. But to answer your original question very briefly, this has actually caused more harm. And I think Steve Wilkinson, if I'm getting the name right,
Yeah,
is
I was
scholar
just
in
going to
US.
mention the political
Yeah,
scientist, the political scientist. He's actually shown measurably. So in one of his papers, Stephen Wilkinson, he's kind of shown how the rise of what's called consociationalism leads to ethnic violence.
Can you please explain that term? It's there in the book, but many listeners might not have understood
So,
that.
so crudely speaking, it's kind of a political science jargon for power sharing or power distribution between groups. So, in a sense, if you look at India through that lens, in India there are religious groups who are sort of sharing power based on group identity, and often that is reinforced by different kinds of laws, and that creates what's called a consociationalist. That's a very awkward and difficult to pronounce word, consociationalist. Let me say that a second time.
Hmm.
System, and Wilkinson has actually shown that over several decades in India, that has led to rising violence.
Okay. So you're saying that secularism needs to be, redefined. But one question.
So the core actually, Utkarsh, to conclude, I would say, is that uh, Indians are individuals. They are not members of a group. And the Indian state should not say, show me your religion and I show you the law. That's what's happening right now. The Indian state says, okay, this guy is a Hindu, this woman is a Christian, this woman is a Muslim, this man is a Muslim, whatever, based on that. And in fact, there are gender variations even within religion. So laws should be gender neutral, obviously with appropriate exemptions, and even religion neutral.
Yeah. So I was about to come to that before diving into the economic aspects of the book, that you both argue for, individual rights a lot. And, there is an identity or a willingness or a choice of one person, which is really important, as you explained. And then there is also a group identity, an identity or an affiliation to multiple things. So how does the modern Indian who studied at Columbia or INSEAD reconcile with this identity of being a part of, say, a global, maybe elite, plus the Indian, trying to figure things out, plus all the, say, religion X, Y. How does all of this fit into
Yeah,
your?
so that is actually exactly the point that we are making, is that today individuals see themselves in multiple ways, right? So I've spent a lot of time in New York, studying there, working there. So somewhere I'm a New Yorker. I like to see myself as a New Yorker somewhere. I feel at home when I'm traveling there. I'm born in Calcutta. I'm a Calcuttan. I'm an Indian. I'm also a Hindu. I went to college at Northwestern, so I'm a Northwesterner in that sense. So I have multiple identities, and the kind of nuances that individuals and society can always see each other as however they wish, but in the eyes of the state, in the eyes of the government, I'm just an Indian, and that's how it should be. So the government should not say that this person is a Hindu and thus the Hindu law applies to him, and this person is a Muslim and there's a different law for that, or whatever. There should be a same sort of standard law, which
Yeah.
we all agree is the minimum basic law for all citizens of India.
Very quick follow-up. So hypothetically, I mean, the three of us are not marginalized per se, but hypothetically, if somebody is historically, how might you propose that be looked at in the eyes of the law? Should there be something called a positive discrimination?
Yeah, so we
Yeah,
actually,
we did
yeah,
talk about that.
yeah, we talk about that in the book. We say, for example, India does have caste quotas. There's something called a scheduled caste group, which has since the beginning of the republic has had quotas or reservation or affirmative action or positive discrimination. We also even have it for scheduled tribes, and it was later added for other backward classes. It's not technically caste, but they kind of more or less lap, even though it includes OBCs and STs include member of all religions, including Muslims and Christians. SC is the only category which has members of only dharmic religions or Indic religions like Hinduism, Buddhism, Sikhism, Jainism, and so on and so forth. So basically, affirmative action in India covers all religions, if you include SC, ST, OBC. And the short answer to yes is yes, we should have some affirmative action, but with the caveat of it should be time bound, there should be a sunset clause. So what I mean by that, what Rajeev and I have written in the book is a couple of aspects. First of all, we failed to focus on, we got the wrong economic policies of the first 3-4 decades, and we'll come to that very quickly. We failed to invest in primary education, and there were groups that are historically marginalized. So giving them a leg up on a time-bound manner is okay. And secondly, so long as you're doing it in a caste or class category, something which you cannot, at least caste, you cannot kind of convert out, right? Caste is by definition where you were born, the parents you were born to. But if you do it solely in the name, exclusively in the name of religion, for example, which you can in any liberal democracy like India convert to or away from a certain religion, then not only are you doing something opposite of secularism, you're also incentivizing conversions. And therefore, our way of understanding is we should have some caste quotas of affirmative action, provided there is an understanding, there is a sunset clause, there is a national consensus created that say by 2030, we'll remove the OBC aspect, or we'll remove some birth-based quotas. By 2047, 100 years of independence, we'll get rid of all quotas, and there will be no positive discrimination because we've had 100 years of a leg up. So long as we can have that kind of
actually, even the caveat there is, I would say, even within affirmative action, that too should be need based. So, for example, when the caste quotas came into the premier institutions of India, the institutions of higher learning in India, the IITs and the IIMs, in the coming years and decades, probably the grandchildren of the first beneficiaries of the caste quotas will be that generation will be able to avail of the quotas. So let's say somebody's grandparent had gone to an IIM. Should they be allowed to avail of the quota again in the same family? I think these are debates that are important and again, like, very contentious. So, I don't want to be misunderstood here, but I do think that such quotas should be targeted to those who need them, even within the marginalized groups, because obviously, within the oppressed and marginalized group too, there are elites.
Fair enough. I mean, again, we could discuss this for a long time, but I just wanted our listeners to understand that this is the point that the authors are doing, right? Our authors are. Now let's ask to investors if profit is a bad word, and how did profit become a bad word?
So I'll go for that. I'll say basically, so the chapter 4 out of 5 chapters, the name of the chapter 4 is "Profit is not a dirty word," which is basically a response to Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru, the first Prime Minister of India, who had told J.R.D. Tata, a doyen of Tata Group, in a personal meeting that Jay, don't talk to me about profit. Profit is a dirty word. And the context was Mr. Tata had brought up, I think, the profitability of the public sector enterprises, which were loss making at that time, and therefore instead of giving capital to the government of India, were kind of absorbing capital. And Mr. Nehru was very kind of shaken and not very keen to discuss these ideas. And I think later on, a similar attitude, in fact, a more vigorous such attitude was taken by Indira Gandhi. And we must remember that, who was Nehru's daughter, that these two prime ministers together were prime ministers for about 35 years, give or take. So, they kind of together, what we in Rajeev call Nehruvian India, they kind of defined the Nehruvian India to some extent, along with the grandson of Nehru, Rajiv Gandhi. So the idea was, it's a very socialistic, almost quasi-communist idea that we are a poor nation, people should not make profits, profits are obscene. Why can't the government own the machinery and the factories and kind of redistribute all the good things? It started off with a bunch of idealism, and then it kind of, as it often happens, transitioned into cronyism and corruption as the reality dawned. Because
economic stagnation.
Yeah, communism as an idea has failed across the world, even socialism in which the government owns industries, as opposed to, say, Scandinavian socialism in which there is a very vibrant private sector, but the government is basically doing redistribution through free school and free health, which is a different form of socialism. But a socialism or a communism or a quasi-communism in which the government owns industries and banks, which is what we tried for 30, 40 years.
And also the government imposes very strenuous price controls.
So there are many issues why we went there, from price controls. The dollar rupee rate was fixed. And despite the fact that the rupee had already kind of in real terms appreciated because we had higher inflation. We could go into the macroeconomics of it, but the real reasons why we kind of stumbled into this, and then it had its own kind of vested interest group of a few crony capitalists, bureaucrats, and politicians who were just very comfortable with this nexus, what was known as the license Raj, where you had to go to Delhi to get a license to increase your cement capacity, plant capacity from say 20,000 tons to 40,000 tons, or whatever the right numbers are. So you had to basically pay bribes for everything, and we ended up in the worst of both worlds. We could not even, because we are a democracy and very proud of it, so you could not control the unions the way communist China and Soviet Russia did. So you had all the labor strikes. The capital was not free. It had to, per force, become corrupt to even survive. Good guys like Aditya Birla left the country. Even Mr. Mittal of Mittal Steel made his real money outside of India, right? So that entire generation of entrepreneurs either had to be co-opted by the system or they had to basically leave India. And so that is the failure. That's the mindset of profit is a dirty word, which still exists in a diluted form today. For example, officially schools in India cannot be for profit, right? And what happens is, you're running Network Capital. Why can't you run Network Capital University in 2 years from now? Well, if you want to, there are all these regulations you have to go through, officially making it non-profit. But if you're connected to a lot of politicians, just make the right politicians and bureaucrats trustees of the trust, and it's all done. And so why do we have this hypocrisy towards profit when if Utkarsh or Rajeev or Harsh are giving good services? You should have the right regulation, of course, the right taxation. So that I think that is basically the mindset that we kind of opposed in that chapter. Rajeev?
Yeah, so this hypocrisy about no one should make money. Money is a bad thing. One of my favorite parts in the book is actually when we delve into some of the aspects of pop culture and how movies actually reinforced this idea that making money is a bad thing and how that is changing now. Actually,
Tell
if
us
you
more.
go back to,
Fascinating. I loved it.
yeah. So if you go back to the 70s and 80s and see some of the older sort of movies, both in Hindi and other languages, or in many languages in India, especially Hindi, which is the largest film industry here, you find that the rich person in films is always, some smuggler, some kind of exploitative businessman. And typically even when businessmen are shown, they are shown as grand dynasties who've existed for a long time. So business is essentially not really for anybody. It's not for the common person. The common person is usually shown as some lawyer or some doctor somewhere, or even a bureaucrat. And people just are, what is the kind of job that the man on the street looks for? He's just looking for a stable sort of service role. But now, if you fast forward like 40 years, it is common to see sort of key characters in movies now taking all kinds of roles, right? So there are people who are DJs, there are people who are working in the corporate world, entrepreneurs. So that whole opportunity set has expanded so dramatically. And the reason that opportunity set was so small 30, 40 years ago was that profit making or money making was seen as something bad. It's something that it's not, even today in certain regions and communities in India, it is seen as, who does that kind of stuff.
But clearly, money in India. I asked you guys have 15 minutes because our listeners. You guys.
Yeah, sure. We can do some questions. Yeah.
Okay. I'm just going to connect that we've got with that I wanted to ask.
Utkarsh, your voice is breaking.
Okay.
Better now.
Combine the questions that I've got from listeners with some of the questions that I anyway wanted to have. So I'm assuming you guys have 15, 20 minutes?
Yeah, we can do 15 minutes, sure.
Okay. So guys, quickly tell me that profit doesn't seem to be a dirty word. There's a movie coming out on Flipkart. Attitudes are changing about money. All of these things have happened. That is really well explained in the book. But there are perplexing challenges that still exist. For example, the one that Harsh talked about. Why education institutions need to be a certain way. So there's still a little bit of a hangover of something, which is stopping India from fast forwarding into the future. when you look at the higher education space, you make a very interesting example of what we on Network Capital like to call the passion economy, where people will sort of mainstream, like little blogger in Uttar Pradesh will, create a different kind of a career. So how should India look at higher education with the changing needs of the market, with COVID that has happened? All of us have studied in the best of places abroad. What might India's future look like? It is not clearly a couple of institutions, right? I don't think two institutions or five institutions can change. There needs to be a mainstreaming which allows people to build their careers of choice. What's your advice to people thinking or tinkering in this space?
So I would say, firstly, the error India made, the policy error India made 50 or 60 or actually even 70 years ago, was that the government that time, with Prime Minister Nehru, they sort of focused on professional education and higher education rather than primary schooling. So instead of spending money and scarce resources at that time, India was, building the temples of modern India, as Nehru called them, the IITs. So I believe that was a policy mistake. India should have prioritized primary schooling. Even today, the emphasis of government intervention has to be in the area of primary schooling, in the sort of getting all children into schools and so on. And when it comes to higher education, actually, frankly, what the government needs to do is step away. There's a need for deregulation. There is a need for bringing in more competition into the area, allowing people to start universities more easily. Today, for example, one of the barriers to having a state level university is the assembly of the state has to pass an act. So for every private university that is operating in a state, there is an act that has to be passed.
Wow.
So
Clear disincentive to,
yeah,
starting.
absolutely, it's a clear barrier to entry. So that means, only the billionaires and the very kind of politically connected individuals can able to pull that, right? I mean, people like you and I can't say that we can pass an act in parliament and provide for that. Pass an act in the assembly. So I think that is actually the key thing for government to do. And in fact, we've not covered that in the book because the national education policy that came, I think, just a month or two ago.
Yeah.
It came after the book was published. But I think that has made many course corrections in this area. However, education in India remains like obviously a concurrent kind of subject, with both the states as well as the union government in Delhi making policies. So I think it will eventually come down to states as to how far and how quickly they want to liberalize. But you're absolutely right. I mean, with the way the whole value of a paper credential from a well-known university, I think that is under kind of serious threat from online learning platforms, from the ability of individuals today to develop skills on their own through virtualization.
Right.
And in fact, the NEP, the National Education Policy, now recognizes that. So I think what we need is government needs to sort of withdraw itself and kind of release the stranglehold it has in higher education and invest heavily in the primary area. That too, not through sort of more government schools, but through instruments like vouchers, as we have described in the book, school vouchers.
In fact, I was just going to come to that. One of the things that I enjoyed reading a lot in the book is the talk about RCT versus budget allocation. So
Yeah.
I would love for you to explain that. But also, what I want my listeners to really take away is that policy should not be measured on how much money it is allocated, but rather how well it is delivered.
Efficacy. Yeah.
So could you please explain very quickly, what is an RCT and why is it important to the future of India? Perhaps taking education as an example.
So an RCT, we actually quote an RCT. RCT is a randomized controlled trial. So there was a randomized controlled trial study that happened, which compared the efficiency on a taxpayer rupee basis for a private school versus a government-run school in the state of Andhra Pradesh, and it found that similar to, in fact, slightly better outcomes were found in private schools for 3 times less the money. And this was done by a professor in University of California, San Diego, partially funded by the Azim Premji Foundation. And our cities have many drawbacks, but in some ways are the gold standard of teasing out causation from correlation.
Hmm.
So based on that and other evidence, we say that it's better that, as Rajeev was mentioning, invest money, or as Utkarsh himself said, how do you kind of separate outcomes from outlays? Your outlay is a budget expenditure. Outcome is the actual teaching and learning, right? So it's not always not enough to metronomically increase by X percentage a school budget every year or have X Y percentage of the GDP, but and the transfer and the translation from outlay to outcome is through incentives. What I mean by that is often private schools have lower teacher salaries but better performance. Why? Because teachers are afraid of being fired in private schools and they're greedy about getting bonuses and incentives. Whereas in a government school, once you get the unionized teacher job, you are a government school teacher for life. So you
Often
get it.
paid. You also make an example of how you make.
Get paid much more. Like a budget private school in a village or a slum would pay you like $10,000, $12,000. 12,000 rupees per month, whereas a government school teacher might get 40,000-50,000 rupees a month. And I'm not saying it's somehow fair that the private school teacher is getting paid 10,000-12,000 rupees a month. I'm not saying it's fair, but that's a market clearing rate. That's where the market is clearing at. They might be doing some private school tuitions on the side.
You keep coming back to let the marketplace.
Let the market. The point is we are a poor country, and one of the problems that people often say, we are still a $2,000 per capita income country for a 1.3, 1.4 billion population, therefore slightly less than $3 trillion GDP. America's GDP, for the viewers, is $65,000 per capita income just before COVID hit. We are, even if you're just for purchasing power parity, we are 8 to 9 times poorer. We cannot have a Scandinavian welfare state on a sub-Saharan Africa income level, right? It's good to have good intentions, good to display good intentions, but at some point, if your entire framework is more for consumption of your literary elites or your political elites in Delhi and South Bombay, as opposed to what it has to do with the reality of the ground, which is still messy, which is still inspiring in many places and ugly in many places, you are going to ultimately fail. And to quickly answer your question on higher education, one thing the government needs to do is much more kind of facilitate and use and exploit technology, especially after COVID. AR, VR, and all of that is there. But one thing the government should do is facilitate standardization of an exam. For example, what I mean by that is, let the private universities be absolutely experimental in their pedagogy, but you can have a common BA, BCom national exit exam. And what that does is, I can run a university, Utkarsh can run a university, Rajeev can run a university, but our students will clear, along with our internal exams, one BA final exam or one BCom exam, and that is excellent for signaling value. That is the standardization of signaling value. So, your education is for two reasons: for the intrinsic learning and for signaling to employers. Labor economics talks a lot about the signaling value of education, especially higher education. So the government, like Japan's MITI did on measurement and standardization, the government can have more and more common exit exams, and the government is already thinking of that. And if you have an exit exam at year 2, you can say it's an associate degree instead of a bachelor degree. Year 1, you can call it a diploma. So you can basically modularize education and leave the actual teaching to technology and private sector, including foreign sector. But so long as you clear this exam, I can compare different students from different places as an employer, for example.
Very helpful. Thank you. Just coming towards the close, we have a couple of more questions. Somebody asks, what's, in your view, the role of the state? Reading the book made me realize that you are largely advocating for a light touch model, but occasionally it seems like you're arguing for a mixed model. And sometimes it feels like you're arguing for a heavy-handed model. So which is it? Like, if as an average reader, what should I think?
So, I think I would simply say by this that Rajeev and I, in chapter 5, which is the last chapter we call Decolonizing the Indian State, we say we want a light touch Indian state, but with extremely good governance capacity. So the few areas where the government needs to be, it should be extremely competent, maybe even hire more people, for example, policing, judiciary, basic regulation. Yeah, they need to do that job much better. For example, get out of public sector enterprises. On the other hand, there is one area where we say we don't fully go with the free market. Just that's kind of, we say there should be some trade and industrial policy, to facilitate Make in India manufacturing. So there's the last part of chapter 4 is called Atmanirbhar Bharat India, which kind of uses the current prime minister's slogan of self-reliance to translate that into English, where we say that you need some moderate protectionism time-bound, along with full internal free markets, infrastructure, education, financial free markets, so on and so forth, so that you, while the world is decoupling partially from China, especially after this pandemic, you need both sticks and carrots. That's maybe one of the exceptions the reader is referring to. But we want a limited government, but a very strong government where it is present. We don't want an anarchy. Rajiv and I often say that if you want to go to a place with no government and you think it's a paradise, please go to Somalia, right? So libertarianism or even moderate libertarianism does not mean no government. We absolutely need good governance.
Got it. So last question. As a young Indian trying to find his or her space in the world today, how might I wear my Indian identity? Is it a matter of pride? Is it a matter of fact? And is it a matter of one day we will arrive?
Harsh, you're on mute.
Okay, I'll go first. So I think we should definitely see it as a matter of all three. It's a matter of fact. It's a matter of pride. It's also a matter of we'll arrive. It's a matter of fact because we have an Indian passport. We are born here, whatever. We are citizens. I think it's a matter of pride because from South Korea to Israel, we are the only functioning democracy in all of otherwise East Asia and Middle East. And we have been for a long time, except for 2 years in the 1970s. So I think that such a large country to be politically free, even while there have been other failures and accomplishments, is something to be proud of. You know, I meet people from communist China when I was outside of India as students or colleagues, and even in closed rooms, they would be afraid of talking about Tiananmen Square. So there is a kind of political fear that we as Indians are simply not used to. And the third point, which your reader kind of very wisely divided into fact, pride, and we will arrive. Yes, I think Rajiv and I actually the summary kind of half chapter towards the end is called India's moment, and I've written separately that I think India's GDP will be $12 trillion by 2030-31. Rajiv is also extremely bullish on the Indian experiment, and actually as part of writing the book, we actually dealt into many micro reforms that we ourselves, despite being finance, political, economic junkies, had not even noticed, even us collectively. So there's a lot of tinkering, and I think finally India is getting the model right. We are right now in a pandemic, and we were in a strong dollar phase last few years. So the growth has not shown up, but I think I'm very bullish for the next few years for exogenous reasons of technology and demographics, but endogenous reasons of policy reform as well. Rajiv?
No, yeah, I mean, I would just say in closing, like a lot of people tend to think that India is a nation of unfulfilled greatness, so to say. And this has been a common sort of disappointment, I would say. Many citizens have it, many other Indophile sort of outside observers have it, that why isn't India able to really rise in that sense? I think we have to connect it back to certain inputs that are necessary from a government to enable that rise. And it is our case, as we have made in the book, that those ingredients are coming now. They have been coming over the last 6 years, and we continue to feel optimistic that the kind of policy changes that are being implemented will shift India to a high growth rate, where I think in the next 15 to 20 years, there will be a prosperous India, which frankly, many people cannot imagine today also. We simply cannot imagine that India will become, insanely rich in some ways, going into the middle part of the century. So I mean, insanely rich means relative to the last 20 years, not on an absolute basis, but relative to where we were. So I do feel very optimistic that whoever asked this question, good reasons that you can be and you will be all of those three things.
So the person who asked this question actually heads our New York Network Capital New York chapter. So the biggest demand for your book or the book talks have come from our South Asian folks living abroad. I mean, just statistically telling you that those are the people who sort of RSVP'd a lot. Those are the people who've. So clearly, I mean, there is demand for people to learn more about the idea of India, even though they're not in India. In fact, more when they're not in India. So we'll perhaps do a
And actually, it makes complete sense, right? Because as the case that we make in the book is that India, that is Bharat, is a civilization, and there are many, what the government of India calls pravasi Bharatiyas,
Hmm.
or what in English we say they are non-resident Indians, or even overseas Indians of overseas origin, or other persons of Indian origin overseas.
Yeah,
So the Indian civilization extends beyond the landmass of India.
it most certainly does. Thank you so much, Harsh and Rajiv. Congratulations on
Thank you.
writing this book that clearly makes a case for a marketplace of ideas that both of you have both engaged in and encouraged other to do so. To follow up soon with Network Lab New York or London, because clearly there's a big demand. But it was such a joy to see our dots connect. Thank you so much. See you very
Thank
soon.
you. Thank you, Utkarsh. Bye bye.
Thank you, Utkarsh. Bye bye.